Okay, we're about to get started. Have the last people come in, and then we'll get started from there. So, as I normally talk as a profession, I'll limit myself to about 20 minutes or something like that. We'll see, and then hopefully you'll have some good questions around this whole thing. We've used this concept, many times around deep techs. So basically, what I'm going to tell you today is just going a little bit more into depth on what that means and some of the geopolitical implications of that, and how you need to support them in your ecosystem. So basically, what is deep tech? Why does it matter? We'll look into some of the challenges about deep tech, and then how to support them. And I think you've seen we've brought at least from MIT some of the key things that we do, but I'll try to talk a little bit more into some of the key elements that you need to do to support them. Also touching upon one of the key things that I find is the most important thing is what I call the demand side. So basically, how to make sure that people actually start buying this. And I'll see if I can move over here, because every time I look up, there's so much, whatever it is that gets into my eyes. I can't see anyone, by the way. Kind of interesting. Anyway, here we go. Yeah, that's me. Okay, so basically, I'll just put myself here so that I know they're going to be annoyed with me on video there, but I think this is the best way so that you can get a sense of what are we talking about here. So basically, we define deep tech as transformative technology that solves the world's most important challenges, the convergence of breakthrough science, engineering, and leadership. So basically, some of the key areas that you're seeing here are obviously there's the whole energy piece, which obviously means an enormous amount of things. And where I have done most of my research is actually on the compute side, on quantum computing, and a little bit on advanced materials. I think it's fair to say that we have an enormous focus on this right now because they're actually developing some of the solutions that we really need, but also because we've had at least a couple of decades where there's been very little focus on this. We thought that we could solve the world with software as a service. We thought that we could solve the world with having more apps in the App Store. And there's a lot of capital that basically was driven into that whole area. So we have seen across the world a fundamental underinvestment into a lot of the things that really matter to us as societies. So that's always been my main focus on this. One of the other things is not mentioned in this, but I think it's a little bit. Maybe if I touch this, is the. Oh, here we go. Oh, wow. Ooh. So this is the space sector, which is one of the key things that I'm working on right now in Europe. And this is just to say that many of these areas also cover the whole dual use and defense space. We haven't talked a lot about this, but there's a huge overlap between many of these areas and basically what you develop in the whole defense area. And most of the technologies, by the way, that you carry on you right now and that there's in this room was developed in defense first. And I think it's fair to say that what we're seeing right now, and I know that Brazil is not part of NATO, but a very important thing happened yesterday at NATO. The summit communique is basically moving from a 2% expenditure to a 5% expenditure of GDP into defense. So that will be huge, enormous amount of spending that we need to see going into deep techs in the future. So I also just want to say that deep tech, of course, is not something that's new in the sense. Basically, it's what has always been the focus of many societies as we have developed. I think the last one is the one you have on your right-hand side, which is basically the one on semiconductors, which is an area that, in terms of a particular focus, I'm not really an expert on. But one of the key things that we're seeing, and it drives me basically also to the next slide, which is to say that deep tech is not only a technological area, it has also become a very much a geopolitical area at the end of the day. So, for example, what you can see here is just some examples of some of them are a little bit old because this guy is not any longer in control of the U.S. We have a new second Trump administration that is really, really focusing on a lot of these tech areas as well. So, and this is from my own home country that we have here. Over here, is that I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but one of the key areas where Denmark is really, really focusing on right now, together with the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Novo Nordisk is the one that is doing Wegovy, so they've had a couple of very good years, is to really drive the whole development of a fault-tolerant quantum computer, which seems to be now really one of those tech races that is happening right now across the world, because the one that can actually do that might be able to reap the benefits not only in drug development, but also in terms of innovation in cryptography. The traditional approach to developing deep tech has really been, first and foremost, built into these large corporations. There is, to some extent, still a lot of things that are being developed in these sort of like more classic ways to do R&D. You have a very strong relationship, for example, here between Petrobras and the universities. This is one of the more classic ways to do this. Through the Levy Fund, for example, is a classic way to develop deep techs in Brazil. But I think the key part is that we have seen that the universities are becoming much more important in the whole development of deep tech across the world. So where it's more been like inside these sort of like institutions, and quite frankly, a lot of these institutions are like historically been quite closed. Some of them put them into a field somewhere where they were outside the sort of traditional innovation ecosystems, or you kind of like symbolically create something that looks like something very ring fenced, basically, because it was also the thing about deep tech is that it's heavily regulated. It has a clear sort of focus on IP protection. So sometimes these things can be quite secretive. But what we're seeing now is that a lot of the deep techs that we saw is now becoming to deep tech ventures, is becoming into companies. And what we're seeing there is that a lot of the universities now have started playing a much more deeper role in being part of that. It is sometimes talked about as being the third mission of universities. So basically saying that besides teaching, education, and besides doing research, one of the key missions of universities is actually to do entrepreneurship, is to be the place where a lot of deep tech become deep tech ventures at the end of the day. The one way to look about this is that we at MIT distinguish between, and I'll leave it up to you to see whether that makes any sense for you, but we basically talk about two different types of the way that the university is providing deep tech and deep tech ventures. One of them is what we call a lab-based, which is the one that you have here on your right-hand side from Form Energy, but more known probably is the one on the right-hand side, which is the founder of Dropbox, which we call more of a dorm-based. Probably the most famous dorm-based company that ever came out is probably Facebook. But I think what we're seeing is a much more of a focus on the universities for moving, you have entrepreneurs coming out of the universities, that you actually have these university spin-outs, which we then call the lab-based ventures that are built on tech. So at least that is one of some of the key things that we're seeing, is that moving from those individuals that, are establishing the companies in the dorms or just right after the university, to really have these key deep tech ventures coming out directly from the university. And by the way, I'm going to explain to you now why you see a unicorn over there and a dolphin there, right? So another way to talk about this, and sometimes this actually started as a joke, but basically one way to look upon this is that we see that a lot of the small and medium-sized companies are, is the camel there on the left-hand side. It can go a long way. It's an incredible animal, but it doesn't really leap forward quite quickly. We have these digital-enabled SMEs, which is the gazelle that we have there. And then obviously we have digitally focused 10X, we call them IDEs. So that's innovative-driven companies or enterprises that we have as the unicorn there. And what we're seeing is a lot of the deep techs are we call dolphins. And we call them dolphins because they sink very, very deep. And then they come up to the surface, and then some of them can actually, at the end of the day, become one of those unicorns at the end of the day. The key problem, though, is that it takes an enormous amount of time. So I'm going to go through some of the examples. So a lot of the venture capital, a lot of the support structures that you see around the world is really focused on driving unicorns. And in terms of the lengths of the fund structures, the whole venture capital is structured, and that is, by the way, one of the key problems. So we need to have a much more focused and specialized support structure for these deep techs. This is just to give you one example, and this is quite an interesting example, which is Commonwealth Fusion Systems. I think it's fair to say that the verdict is, let's see whether we actually get fusion energy. But what we're seeing here is a quite interesting example of something that is really lab-based. So Commonwealth Fusion Systems comes out of MIT, and the key part of this is actually that the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, at some point stopped the funding for ITAR, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, basically building fusion energy, which basically overnight took the whole funding away from a whole several research groups inside MIT. So instead of looking for a new job or whatever they needed to do, they basically said, well, I think we have something. I think we can actually try to commercialize this. So Bob Mumgaard, and who was leading that lab, basically became overnight a spin-out from MIT, and it's been quite a journey for them. So they started obviously with a lot of funding of government funding that they do here. So first of all, I cannot even explain to you how this actually works. I'm not a scientist in that sense. But I think the key part of this is if you look at the funding that they were that they're able to attract. 2017, $65 million was their seed investment, a $200 million Series A, and a $1.8 billion Series B. What this tells us is that, first of all, that there are some investors that are very willing to take a lot of risks, but it also means that basically the whole point here is that a lot of these technologies have a very long, have a high degree of risk, of technological risk, but at the same time, if you are able to actually take away this technological risk and at some point also the market risk, it might be a very, very good investment at the end of the day. Quite interestingly, some of the early stage investors, and still some of the investors into this, is The Engine, which was a venture capital company coming out of MIT, but it was also the Italian energy company called Eni, and it's Breakthrough Energy Ventures. So basically the people around Bill Gates that is sort of heavily invested into this. So one of the secret reasons that they actually wanted to invest into this is that to build their solution, and the verdict is still out that if it would actually work, is that the magnets that they need to build for this are going to be so incredible magnets that they're already figuring out how they can use them into another product, like an MRI scanner. So one of the key insights that we get from deep tech is that even getting to the final solution is ways ahead. Some of the de-risking on the technology side actually have these spillover effects. And that's quite an interesting way to actually, when you look into the nerdy pieces of this and how you actually finance this. So a lot of the things that I work a lot with the NATO Innovation Fund, for example. Some of the things that we look into when we invest into these type of companies, when we do the due diligence, is whether there are milestones through that route until the end product that can already be commercialized, in that sense, can start by de-risking. That has become a fundamental way to actually drive in some of that capital. So this basically just shows you that you've had more and more, so DTVs are deep tech ventures, have basically, we have seen an increase of venture capital going into this area. So first and foremost, this is a good story. We are now seeing that a lot of the venture capital and the fund managers are using their available capital to basically drive this into deep tech. And this, we're seeing a movement away from just being software as a service and that is, fundamentally a very, very good thing, because it just gives a lot of confidence in the market that this is something that is worth investing into. Still, though, there is a problem outside Silicon Valley and the greater Boston area. It is still quite a challenge to get venture capital into deep tech ventures. That's why I'm very happy to see that there was this launch of a venture capital fund into the green transition from Petrobras and BNDES and FINEP. And my understanding is that there will soon be a fund manager, maybe starting already in October, November. We'll start doing some of those investments, because I think the key part is, like, if you are a deep tech person coming out of university and you really want that seed funding, I still believe that it's quite hard here to find that type of capital. But so I'm very, very happy to see that now that this capital is also will be quite soon become available also in Rio and obviously in Brazil in general. Because the key problem, and what we're seeing also, me as a European, is that a lot of this capital, a lot of those technologies that are out there are being actually de-risked by American and Middle Eastern venture capital. So as soon as you get to a certain degree, basically the ownership and the control of the company through that injection of capital is first and foremost coming from the US, and to a larger and larger extent from the Middle East. So this is another way to talk about deep tech. So basically, we have what we call some significant risk areas. So these are the classic risk areas that are here. The main thing that I would like to talk about here is basically, so the market risk I talked about already. The technology risk is known for everyone. Basically, are you bending the laws of gravity or not? But basically, the scaling risk and the regulatory risk is one of the key things that is really a big problem. Specifically the scaling risk, because what we're seeing is that as soon as you start producing within deep tech, you often need new types of production. Another way to talk about deep tech is actually you're industrializing. You're actually maybe re-industrializing a whole new area, like you, for example, would do within the energy sector. And what we're seeing is that it is very, very hard to find the talent, even find the people who can build quality within production at the end of the day. The good thing is that what we're also seeing, because we are looking into building production, what we're seeing in many countries is that the deep tech ventures is actually creating a lot of great jobs, a lot of blue collar jobs, by the way, because it's actually creating new types of fabrication and new types of production sites. Whereas quite fundamentally, what we see in software as a service, for example, is that it might generate a fiscal revenue at the end of the day. But it will make very few people very rich. But most of the people that are working behind the scenes in a software as a service are often situated completely differently, right? They are often, for example, in India or somewhere else. And that means that as you're creating these companies, from a socioeconomic viewpoint, you're creating good services, but you're not creating a lot of societal wealth. You're creating wealth for very few people. But if you focus your energy, so to speak, on deep tech, it's basically not only creating good solutions, you also have a great societal impact because you're creating new types of jobs in your economy. So for those that come from the government, this is important because that gives you a good excuse to how you should actually fund this at the end of the day, also politically. So what I'll do now is, and I'll quickly go through this, and then we'll have time for some questions, is that I just want to focus on some key features that, just because we just had a conversation around capital, but it's very, very important that we need much more than capital to de-risk in these four dimensions. And I'll look into people, some of the unique infrastructure that is needed. You need some very expert investors. I'm going to look into that a little bit more deeply. And then we need these early stage customers at the end of the day. And maybe we can have a conversation around, where is Rio, where is Brazil, very sort of strong here, and where do you need to do more at the end of the day. So basically, this is a slide that basically talks about, the enormous amount of work that you need to do to have your universities engage in what we call would-be deep tech entrepreneurs on campus. These are some of the examples that we run at MIT. There is at MIT more than 90 different programs to become an entrepreneur. If you want to become an entrepreneur, you will become an entrepreneur at MIT. But I think there is one of the key things that we've really been working with here, specifically for Rio, is because I keep hearing on and on again, is that the universities are not incentivized. We do not have enough people coming out of universities that really want to become an entrepreneur. The last session I saw was about IP. It was in Portuguese. I didn't understand a thing. But it seems like a classic sort of conversation around the problems of IP and how you move IP out of university and bring it to the market and stuff like that. And I think when I arrived many years ago, first time at MIT, what they basically did is that they had the same problem. For example, you need to evaluate the market value of a patent. And based on that, you have your licensing agreement, and that can take forever. You've never even talked to the market as you do all these calculations. So what we basically did is that we drew up one contract. So if you are a researcher and you now have a patent and MIT's licensing office has agreed to do a patent on this, we will give you, and it's a one-piece document, and it costs $2,000. We'll give you 2 years to figure out whether you can commercialize this or not. If it seems to be that you have hit something very, very important, and this is worth billions, it tells you to go back to MIT and renegotiate. That single one piece of paper has changed everything, because you've moved away from being, we need to work with these large corporations and how we do licensing agreements, to basically just telling an individual, here's one pager, I need $2,000, sign on the bottom line, and you've got the next 2 years to figure out whether you can make this happen. Go to the market. Let the market decide, or whatever you want to do this. So instead, but most universities, most of the universities I still know in Europe, spend more time negotiating in an office about the IP than actually just trying to get it to the market and see whether the market even wants it at the end of the day. These are some of the infrastructures that are super important that I know that you also have here. What you have here in the bottom is the MIT, what is called MIT Nano. The key thing here is that this is sponsored by MIT and some private investors. It's a very, very advanced site for nanotechnology. There's a lot of these centers around the world. The fundamental difference between this one is it's open 24/7. You need a 2-hour course to be able to enter. It's open for large corporations. It's open for entrepreneurs. You can be one person or you can be a big company that will give you access. We don't ask you questions around the IP. We don't care. You just have access to these type of things 24/7 at the end of the day. So we've taken away all the friction. So once again, the thing here is not to have advanced experiments. It's not the thing about having all this equipment. It's basically make it frictionless access at the end of the day. That's the main, hopefully someone didn't get hurt. So that's the fundamental thing that we've learned, is that a lot of countries set up these supportive infrastructures for deep tech. Fundamental problem, you come out of university, you've graduated from university, you've been using the equipment of the university to do experimentation. As soon as you've left the university, it becomes problematic to actually get access back at your university. I don't know how it is here, but this is probably the same. As soon as you have left the university, so we have a lot of hangarounds at MIT that just don't want to leave, right? One of the reasons that we created this and we created that single contract was that we had too many students hanging around midnight at MIT, and they just got a key so they could go back in and do an experiment. So we needed to create something so there was access 24/7 to whatever you need. in a way that's legalized, because this is still the US, we don't want a lawsuit, right? At the end of the day. So as you think about these things, as you think about these fantastic, companies that you have and how they can get access to their infrastructure that you might be able to use for experimentation, make sure that if they do so, that on their site is open 24/7, for example, and you're not met with an email from a lawyer. You need to sign 30 documents before you can even get an access, and someone will need to follow you around so they make sure that you don't do anything that you shouldn't do. If that's the way you're doing it, you're failing, because nobody wants to use it at the end of the day. Because if you're an entrepreneur, you have two things of scarcity: your money and your time. It all depends. The way that you put in these structures signals who is your hero. And if your hero is an entrepreneur, you need to make it quick, effortless, and open all the time, because these people work all the time. Being an entrepreneur is not getting to job at 9 and going home at 5. They get up very early and they rarely sleep. That's just the way it is. But it's their own choice. But there's a reason that it's open 24/7. It just needs to be open 24/7. This is an example from Denmark. I've already talked about infrastructure, but basically we set up something called Quantum Foundry, which is an access to state-of-the-art within developing quantum technologies. And they took the lesson from MIT, so it's available 24/7. As long as you have an access card, you can go there and you can do your thing wherever you want to do it. And we've put it outside of the Copenhagen University, because Copenhagen University would not accept any legal requirements around IP, because under Danish law, they'll need to do so. So we basically put it outside the university. So it's 100 meters outside the university, but we can claim it's not the university, and then everyone can walk in. So sometimes you just need to be creative about how you do things. This is just a quick slide on once again the very sort of type of capital that you need to get into this, and I don't want to get into all of the details around this, but I think one of the key things that we are seeing is deep tech takes an enormous amount of time. So that means that most of the funds that I've worked on and setting up in venture capital are at least 10 years. Sometimes some are longer. You might, in traditional VC, there might be a little bit, they're often shorter. When we set up the NATO fund, we set it up as a 15-year fund, which gives you an active investment time period of 7 to 8 years, which gives you much better time to actually, when you do the investments, to allow that company to do their de-risking. We see a lot of these fund managers having a very significant technological expertise. So basically, you're seeing fund managers that have an overweight of PhDs in technological areas and little less McKinsey's, right? So they're a little less good with spreadsheets, but a little better at actually understanding the technology. And in this case, that's a good thing at the end of the day. What sometimes goes wrong is when you have a classic spreadsheet approach to how you do due diligence and in developing the investment memo on deep techs. You need very specialized investors into this area. So that's going to be critical as you also develop your own ecosystem here, is to pay attention that the current fund managers actually also upgrade or change fundamentally the way that they do investment and their whole team that is doing investments at the end of the day. A very important thing is the funding model, the mix of equity grants and public-private partnerships. So one of the key things that is very important is that the equity model for deep techs works as long as we have long fund lifetime. But as soon as we get into actually building production, they actually need more advanced debt products. So the combination of equity plus debt becomes quite important, because the debt will basically fund the actual production side and the hard tech of this. Because if you do that through the equity, you'll get to a point where basically you become way too diluted, and you cannot actually grow your team. You can't take in all the investors at the end of the day. So where this is working very, very well, and certainly in some of the ecosystems, is where you have this combination of debt plus equity is very important. On the risk tolerance, maybe a quick word there. Most of maybe I should say, fundamental factor most of the deep techs is that they are B2B. Right? Just to say it out loud, it's B2B. A lot of them are working with a customer, but the customer is not yet paying. They're basically working with them to develop their product. So that means that a lot of the investments here are very much pre-revenue in that sense. Like Commonwealth Fusion Systems that received an enormous amount of money is still pre-revenue, right? At the end of the day. So that's just the risk that needs to be there. So this one I want to say. So I already announced this just a little bit, and I wanna spend a little more minutes on this because it's an area that is normally we do not pay a lot of attention to. It's also because it's boring. It is less, fancy than talking about entrepreneurship and all these type of things, because what we're talking about here is basically how often governments can drive and become an early stage customer here. So let me just talk a little bit about maybe the one that you have here, which is DARPA, which is sort of my favorite example of how you can use a particular type of structure to basically be a market pull of all of the technologies. So DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the fundamental R&D agency of the Department of Defense. It's the agency in the US that have funded GPS, the internet, stealth, and most lately also MRN. And it's the way that they work is that they basically make these incredible bets on new types of companies, and they're doing it right now in quantum. The key part is that they're using afterwards the Department of Defense as a buyer of what they've put their money into. So basically, they have a control not only of the supply of capital, but also of the buying of who actually buys the capital. Who buys the solution. So the main reason, for example, that we have autonomous vehicles or drones is that at a very early stage, the Department of Defense in the US paid the hundreds and hundreds and millions of dollars for those type of prototypes that we have. So I think one of the key things, if there's at least one thing I would like you to take away from this presentation, is that the ones that win on the market is not the ones that has the best technology. The country that wins is not the country that actually puts more money into R&D or funds universities. It's the one that is best as actually being the best buyer. The early stage buyer is the most important thing. ISA Aerospace is a new, give you just one example. ISA Aerospace from Munich in Germany is a very promising rocket company that we really want and really need in Europe, because if you don't have rockets and rocket launch capability, you can send satellites into space. If you cannot send satellites into space, you cannot control your communication. You need rocket launch, and you need rocket launch capability to control communication. Okay? The fundamental problem in Europe is that we now have this company. It's very well funded, has a lot of venture capital, but who's buying? Right? So Europe is now going to buy 5 potentially rocket launches. The US is going to buy 100. So where do you think that technology is going? It's going to the US. So I think in a lot of these deep tech areas, and this is more of a geopolitical viewpoint, it's more of about national security, that a lot of these deep tech companies become so important. And the way that you basically make sure that they thrive and develop the solution, also if you are for Brazil, is to make sure that there is buyers. And there are these early stage buyers that keep them here. Because otherwise you will become an accelerator for the rest of the world. You will have paid everything until they become important, and then they move, and then they become important there at the end of the day. So you need the supply side of the venture capital, but you really need to make sure that you have corporations and you have a government that leans in as a buyer, as that early stage buyer. That's very, very important. That's from a European perspective, a big problem because that is seen as putting a hand on the market traditionally. That is also the way it's looked upon in the US, but in many areas where it matters to the US, they just don't care. So they just put the hand on the market and they just buy, and they buy a lot of it, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, what was the Inflation Reduction Act? It was early stage, making sure that the US would be the first and predominant buyer of things within the energy transition. Basically, that was tax credits for early stage buying. Another example of that, which is maybe not as known. The COTS project was initiated by the National Space Agency, and they did it in a way so that they asked for the procurement of that, they asked